This is our third session of our Draft, Submit, Revise, and Manuscript Writing series. If you've been with us since the first session, we are in the manuscript manufacturing phase. So we kind of learned what a manuscript is, and now we're going to learn how to write it. So we have three awesome speakers, Whitney Sweeney, Marie Fleisner, and then Nasia Safdar. Marie is the one who's having technical difficulties, so we might have to move her around for when she joins in. But we're going to start with Whitney Sweeney. Actually, before I begin, just to note, she's right next to me, so she's, going like this, not sure what's happening. For those of you who've been watching our recordings, we do have a new YouTube channel. Woo! So for those who have been dealing with our technical difficulties, I appreciate you working with us, but you can now find the recordings on our YouTube. So you could just look up Ictor on YouTube and they're there. And so this recording for today will be up there within the week. So check that out. Super exciting. If you could keep your cameras and your mics off, that would be great. We'll take questions for each speaker after they go. So Whitney is here and we will switch over to her.
Excellent. So I am a scientist in the Team Science Core here in the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research. And we often talk about how to handle authorship with our teams. So I'm going to share some of our information and best practices with you. So one of the reasons we talk about authorship a lot, I don't think this will come as a surprise to anybody, is that authorship of scientific papers is one of the most contentious issues in research ethics. So it's one of the most contested things. It's probably the most common thing that people have disagreements about. And that can come in a number of different forms, whether it's honorary authorship, so somebody who didn't really make a contribution but is named an author, ghost authorship, people who are completely left off publications. I know that happens, unfortunately. And then there's the other issues that have to do with multiple authorship in terms of big team science. So we're doing more and more interdisciplinary research in terms of consortia. And sometimes we have hundreds of authors and trying to figure out how to deal with that and then how to handle disputes that arise and dissenting opinions. So we'll talk a little bit about the bigger authorship policies towards the end of what I have to share with you, but just sort of setting the stage that authorship is often causes conflict. So this next slide here shows one of the interventions that we do in our Team Science Core called collaboration planning. And this is a 90-minute facilitated session for teams. And we go through 7 different thematic areas. So we talk with teams and help them strategically plan, so they can identify their team vision, people's roles and responsibilities, elements of project management. And then you'll notice there, hopefully you see the little red box around the team outputs. We also talk about what's going to be the product of their research. And invariably, we ask them, do you have an authorship policy? And I can say of the, so there it says we've done 50 collaboration plannings. I haven't done all of those, but of the collaboration planning sessions that we've done in the last 2 years, nobody has had a formal authorship policy. Many teams have had informal authorship where we'll talk about it as it comes along, but we realize that this is something that teams often don't do and that they probably should do again to avoid some of those conflicts that arise. So I'm going to share with you next some guidelines for authorship. So we've often gotten questions from our collaboration planning sessions and other team science workshops and interventions. They said, well, can you give us any guidelines? How do we make these decisions? So the first that I'm sharing with you comes from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE. And these guidelines are really more for who should be included on the paper. So as some of you who have published may have seen these in different forms. I know if you've published in the Journal of Clinical and Translational Science, they use these. So you should be on the paper if you've had a substantial contribution to the concept or design of the work, acquisition, analysis, or interpretation. And you worked on creating the paper, you're involved in the final approval of the paper, and you agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So these are pretty general, and these are basically helping you decide as a team who gets to be on the paper But then that's usually not the source of contention. It's often the order that people are included as authors. And so again, people have asked for guidelines for this. So I'm going to share with you just a couple of tools that you can use just to help you make some of these decisions for your teams. This one is from Stephen M. Koslin from Harvard University. It was actually shared with me by another group that I collaborate with. And so this one's very, very specific. It goes through and it has you rate and you get points for the different aspects that you are contributing to the paper. So did you have the idea? Were you involved in the design, implementation, conducting the experiment, data analysis? And you'll notice that each person's listed, and you can make this grid as big as you like, and people get points. And then as you look at the different points, you can decide the order of the people, the order of the authors. Now, I haven't actually used that particular rubric, but I have used the contributor roles taxonomy or credit. In fact, for my most recent publication, we used a credit statement where we talked about each individual's contribution to the paper that we were working on. So again, you see some of the same kinds of categories that were in the previous rubric. So conceptualization, data curation, I'm going to jump ahead, resources, software, visualizations, writing original, and writing, reviewing, and editing. And so you can go through and look at all of those different kinds of contributions. And then here's an actual example that I took from Elsevier. And this is a paper, and I believe the reference is there if you want to go look at the paper. But these were authors of this paper, and you'll see that Zhang San was involved in conceptualization, methodology, software, whereas, jumping to the end, Sun Qi was involved in writing, reviewing, and editing. So this provides another way to help make it clear what people's contributions were to the project. Just go ahead. I believe we'll take questions at the end.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So the next thing I wanted to do was to share with you an example of how one large consortia handled their authorship policy. And so there was a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional genomics implementation study. The acronym they used was CHARM. And they had 75 members and 10 institutions and multiple time zones. And they started to talk about publishing some of the papers based on the work that they were doing. And very quickly, as a quote from the paper, halfway through the study, discussions about manuscript planning revealed variations in expectations regarding authorship and manuscript development. So they noticed early on that they were starting to have some dissenting opinions and conflicts related to publication of the work that they were doing. So they took a very structured and intentional approach to handle their authorship equitably, inclusively, and efficiently. So this large consortia had small group meetings where they were working to get everybody's voices heard. We know from the science of team science that if you want to have all voices heard, sometimes you have to be creative and create smaller venues for that. So they ask questions like, what does authorship mean to you? Why is it important? What has been your experience in the past? What challenges have you experienced? And what processes may help to address challenges that arise? So they ask very intentional questions about people's expectations and experiences and their suggestions for how to handle things going forward. They then held large group meetings where they also discussed these different questions. They compiled all of that information and put together shared drafts of what they were called their authorship guidelines. So they had the small group meetings, the larger group meetings, and then they shared these drafts for additional feedback. And after all of this was done, they came up with 3 general overarching guidelines. And again, their goals were to promote equity, inclusion, and efficiency. So the first was to clarify roles and responsibilities of all of the authors. And so here's a table from their paper where they listed what they thought were the most important responsibilities as they planned the manuscripts they were going to prepare. And so there are things like contribute to the project in a way related to the manuscript, submit manuscript to journal, approve final version, and you can read all of these. So they made it very clear what the responsibilities were. And then you can see on the right that they tried to assign those responsibilities to the different authors on the paper. So that's absolutely one thing that you could do as you plan your manuscript preparation. The second, which I thought was the most meaningful to me even, was that this was a very values-based approach. So they articulated their values and principles and clarified behaviors and practices in order to live or honor those values and principles. So again, they were looking for equity, inclusion, and efficiency. And so under equity, they wanted to distribute authorship among those guiding the key aspects of the study. So those contributing the most would be given the most prominent authorship. But you also see there that they want to encourage junior members to be first authors and senior members as mentors. They wanted to have the lead authors identify second and third authors. So that was those were the things that they were doing to help it be equitable. In terms of inclusion, they encourage considering who's already been active on projects. So again, they didn't want all of the same authors all of the time. And so they wanted to give opportunities to other people in the consortia. And then efficiency has to do with just being mindful and reflexive about the bandwidth of everybody involved. If you commit to a project, do you really have the bandwidth to do that? So that has to do with articulating your values and principles. And then the final is to establish the infrastructure to support manuscript development. And I'm not going to say much about that other than it's important to create that infrastructure, to manage those projects in a way so that things move forward smoothly and swiftly. So I think I'm just about out of time. So normally if we had more time, I would have a larger group discussion about this, but given that we're limited in that regard, I thought I would ask these questions and sort of plant the seed so you can think about it within your own teams. So thinking about describing your team's approach to authorship. Do you have an official policy? Ask yourselves what factors are important for your team in determining authorship. The study I just described had certain values they were lifting up. And has your team experienced any conflict related to authorship? How have you dealt with that? And how was it resolved? And so at this point, I will stop and see if there are any questions.
That first question was, can you share the points rubric?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, you can have that with the slides, and I believe there might be a link. Some of these are available also on the web, and I'll make sure that you have what you need.
Awesome. So there was another question. It seems that there's a growing practice to submit papers with first co-authorship. Is there any specific guidance on approaching this, or should be approached on a case-by-case scenario?
That's a really great question. I would say I would approach it on a case-by-case scenario. I think that my encouragement would be for your team to talk about it, to talk about how your team generally wants to approach this, especially in terms of who needs the publications the most. And if two individuals really did, in fact, contribute so that they should be first authors, then absolutely honoring that. But again, just encouraging your team to talk about how you want to handle that.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks so much, Whitney.
Thank you, everyone. Please feel free to
awesome.
reach out with any questions, and we'll make sure you have the slides.
Yes. You'll be getting all of that information along with the resource guide after this. Yeah, Marie, if you just want to start by introducing yourself and talk a little bit about your
My
background.
name is Marie Fleischner. I am the editorial specialist at the Marshfield Clinic Research Institute. and I've been there a really long time. And I'm going to be sharing, talking a little bit about how to format your manuscript so that you get the best results, so that ultimately you can get your manuscript published, because once you've conducted your research and written your manuscript, that is your ultimate goal. And I had some technical difficulties getting on Zoom, so I do apologize for that.
And Marie is a really great resource for those at MCRI. So I just wanted to.
I've been, yeah, like I said, I've been in this position for over 20 years. So I know a lot about the manuscript editing, formatting, proofreading, submission process. I work with most of the researchers at the medical research institution. Okay, there we go. So, and Jen, because I don't have them, I'll need to ask you to forward, and you can go past that one. That was just kind of my introductory slide. So you've finished your research. Writing your manuscript can sometimes be as difficult and time consuming as conducting your study. Well, maybe not. But simply writing your paper isn't enough, because you want it to stand out. So careful preparation really is key to avoiding some common mistakes that can prevent your paper not just from being published, but from being returned or rejected without review. Because ultimately you want your paper to get past that first step. So identifying a proper target journal is key, but following the journal's author guidelines really is essential. So I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about those early steps for submission. So Jen, next slide. This should all look familiar to anybody who's written a scientific manuscript. These are the general structure and style of a manuscript. You're going to have a title page, abstract. I'm going to go quickly through that. I'm not going to teach you how to write a paper, but when you are ready to submit to a manuscript journal, you need to pay attention to the structure used by a journal, not just the sections, but also the order of the sections. For most medical journals, it's going to be introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, but some scientific journals do list the methods section last. So just look at what your journal wants. Next slide, please. So identifying a suitable journal is really important. A common mistake that a lot of authors make is submitting their paper to the wrong journal. I'm going to give you a brief example. For example, I am the editorial specialist for the Journal of Agro-Medicine, which is housed in the Medical Research Institute in Marshfield. Our journal publishes translational research related to agricultural health and safety in medicine. Recently, a group of veterinarians submitted a paper to our journal about the toxicity of gentamicin in rats and dogs. Well, that doesn't even fit within the scope of our journal, so I immediately rejected that paper. They could have avoided that had they read the author instructions that told what that was. So there are some tips to consider when you look at a journal. Look at their website, read their author instructions. It's easy to figure out where you want to go. Next slide, please. Okay, some additional things to look at. Look at the topics. Is the scope narrowly focused, or is it a broad and general scope? Is the content of your paper, is it research-based? Is it analytical? What is the target journal of the target audience of the journal? Something that you want to look at. Are there length restrictions on the articles? If your paper is a 5,000 word paper and the journal has a limit of 2,000 words, you're going to get your article bounced back right away. What about the reputation of the journal? You want to look at that. Do you have, what are the previous authors published? Is your article of a similar level? Look at time of publication. Is the journal published? Is it a weekly journal? Is it a monthly journal? Is it a quarterly journal? And is time of publication important to you? These are all things that you need to look at. Once you've had a list of potential journals, then go to the journal's website and read their author instructions, look at the factors, make sure that your manuscript is a good match. And look at if things like other journals, things like open access. Open access is going to allow more people to read your journal or your article, but it also means you're going to have to pay. So do you have the funds to pay for that? And it's also a good idea to identify a second or third target journal in case your first choice, you get rejected from your first choice, because that does happen. Next slide, please. Going to talk just a little bit about impact factor. Impact factor is one measure of a journal's reputation, but it's not the only journal, or it's not the only factor. Some authors will identify a journal based solely on an impact factor, but that shouldn't be the one thing that you base your, it shouldn't be primarily what you look at. And don't be dazzled by a really high impact factor, because this can lead to disappointment and unnecessary delay. You know, unless your work is really groundbreaking, starting with a really top impact factor journal like the New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA might not be your best choice. These journals receive thousands of submissions every year, and you might not even make it past the editorial review unless your work is groundbreaking. So it might be a good place to start with one of the journals from your reference list. However, avoid starting too low. You know, if you have a your work is really important and you think it's really important, don't start too low. Look again at other journal or the names of journals that are on your reference list. And you can consider some of the open access journals as long as you have the ability to pay for these open access. And this should be something that you should have considered as you started looking for journals. Next slide, please. And speaking of open access, that brings us to predatory journals. With the increased launching of publications and publishers, predatory journals are out there, and there are a lot of them. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish between a predatory journal and a legitimate open access journal, because most predatory journals are going to charge. And a predatory journal is defined as those that unprofessionally abuse the author pays publishing model for their own profit. And that was made by Beale back in 2012. And some of you probably have heard of Beale's list. And Beale's list is still out there, but because of the number of predatory journals, Beale's list has stopped being updated. So you can still access it, but not all of these predatory journals are going to be on it. So some tips for identifying a predatory journal is, first of all, beware of unsolicited emails. Unless you are a top scientist in your field, most journals are not going to come looking for you. So if you get an email saying, hey, you know, we heard about what a wonderful scientist you are and about your great work, and we'd really like you to publish in our journal, most of the time, those are going to be emails from a predatory journal. So make sure you consult with your medical reference librarians. They're good people for you to have. They can help you identify things. Look at the journal's website. Look at their editorial board. Try to contact their editor or some of the members of their editorial board. A lot of predatory journals will put legitimate scientists listed as members of their editorial board, but they're really not. So try to contact those people. Look for their peer review process and their publication timelines. Most predatory journals, not all, but most won't really have peer review. And if they tell you that they can publish your paper within a week or two, that means they don't have a peer review process. Anybody who has done peer review knows that peer review is not going to happen in 1 or 2 weeks. And then there are some other things that you can look for. You can look in PubMed, look in Scopus, look in the Web of Science. And then I have some websites that can help you identify. And you'll get these slides, so I'm not going to read those right now. Next, please. Next slide. So style does matter. You can submit a paper without looking at any style. And believe me, as an editorial specialist, when I get a paper in and it's obvious to me that the authors haven't even tried to look at at our style guide or our house style, I will usually send it back and say, look at our author guide and redo your paper and then send it back. So make sure you read the author instructions and the author guide. Next slide. Read examples of the articles in the journal you're considering and be sure that your article is a good fit. Look at the types of articles that they accept. If you've written a case report and your journal and that journal doesn't accept case reports, it's going to come back. Again, word limit. Look at the word limit for that of the paper that you're submitting. Look at your language, the tense, past, present, and future. Third person versus first person. It used to be standard that research papers were written in third person. That's kind of changing now. A lot of papers are now being written in first person. And look at your referencing convention. Format your references to the journal's designated style. It does matter. You may think it doesn't, but it does. Many journals use the ICMJE style guideline for manuscript preparation, and you can get reference or bibliography software that can help you. And even using PubMed, you can go into PubMed, and I think you already had something on this on how to do your referencing, right? Okay. So, and if you're from the Marshfield Clinic Research Institute, I can help you with that. Next slide. I'm going to go quickly through these because I know I don't have a lot of time, but pay attention to things like units of measure, numbers. The general rule is when you're using a number less than 10, and this is pretty standard, so you probably know this, it should be spelled out unless it's an age or a unit of measure, and you should never use a number to start a sentence. Abbreviations and acronyms, there are some standard ones, and I know sometimes scientists in their field think that an acronym is standard, but that doesn't mean that it is. And an abbreviation should be spelled out the first mention, and then the acronym should be used after that, and it needs to be used at least 3 times. If it's only used twice, it should be spelled out. Next slide. I talked about past versus present tense, third person versus first person. Pay attention to punctuation because it does change the meaning of your sentence. I find inspiration in cooking my family and my dog versus I find inspiration in cooking my family and my dog. All right, next slide. Data. Everybody should know this, but you'd be surprised how many people use their verbs with data incorrectly. Data is the plural of datum. So it's data were collected, not data was collected, but that's oftentimes used incorrectly. Be careful with repetition of ideas and winding sentences. When you're writing things, I often see papers that come through where they repeated things. Be careful with improper capitalization. Okay, next slide. This is just briefly, I'm going to talk about plagiarism. I've given entire presentations on plagiarism to some of our medical students. One of the most common writing errors is plagiarism. Oftentimes it's done inadvertently, but it's still wrong. And with plagiarism checking, you shouldn't be submitting papers with plagiarism in. But plagiarism is when text, ideas, concepts, and images are copied as is. I used to work with a researcher who his way of writing would be to copy and paste into his paper directly from his references and then go back and rearrange the words afterward, but sometimes he'd forget. Not a good way to write a paper. So writing that's presented as original with proper citation is unethical, and even if it's done inadvertently, and failing to cite your own sources is still plagiarism. So there are some, you can use Grammarly, DupliChecker, Authenticate. So just be sure that you're not quoting things without properly citing them. Okay, next. Your title. Your title is a really important part of your paper. It's the first thing that a reader is going to see, and more people will read your title than any other part of your publication. It's reproduced in the table of contents in a journal, and it'll be used by librarians for abstracting services. And oftentimes readers are going to use the title to decide whether to read your article. Next. This is just a table that shows elements of a good title for a scholarly publication, tells you what a good title contains and what a poor title contains. And I'm not gonna read all that because you can access the slide later. Next. So a good title should describe the contents clearly and precisely, should reflect the tone of your article, provide some keywords for indexing. Titles should not include wasted words such as a study of or an investigation of. It should avoid abbreviations and jargon, and you should not attempt to attract attention with humor or puns. However, on that other side, sometimes people do. So you can look at some of those punny titles. Medical marijuana, why can't we all just get a bong? I'm going to skip all of those, but those were a few punny ones that I found. Next. Okay, your abstract. And why do I talk about this at the end? Because the abstract comes at the beginning of your article, which is true, but it's the last thing that you write. So surveys have shown that more than 80% of researchers only ever read abstracts. And I know that's true because I work with several scientists who, even in getting their references, they only read the abstract for the references of the articles that they use. So your abstract will state the main objectives. What did you investigate and why? It should describe your methods, summarize the most important results, state your conclusions. And one thing you need to be sure with your abstract is stay within the word limit set by the journal. And also make sure that if the journal wants a structured abstract, you structure your abstract. If it's unstructured, it's unstructured. Next. And I'm just going to briefly go through this, tables and figures. Most of your articles are going to have some tables and figures, and they should summarize the results, but not present large amounts of raw data. That shouldn't be in your paper. If you need to do that, you can put that as some supplementary tables or figures. Your tables shouldn't duplicate results that are already in your text. They should be sequentially numbered. They should have a title. Same with figures. And also be sure that each table and figure is cited appropriately within the text. Be sure that the journal knows where your table and figure should go. Okay, next. So in summary, proper formatting may not increase the probability of final acceptance of your manuscript, but it will increase the probability that your paper will at least make it through the first round of editorial checks and get it into the hands of an editor or reviewer, which will increase the chances of being accepted. So some of the main editorial reasons for rejection, and this is based on my experience of being an editorial specialist, the manuscript doesn't fall within the journal's aims and scopes. It doesn't conform to our style. It has poor style, grammar, punctuation, or English. Sentence structure is clumsy and awkward. It's not contextualized. It's messy with sloppy proofreading. That's where I can come in. And the writing is incomprehensible. All right, thank you. Any questions for me?
Yeah, so we'll take any questions. I've not been looking at the chat, but there was a question that was brought up last session that I can ask you, Marie. Do you know of any resources for those who struggle with making figures, whether it be just sort of understanding what data to show on a figure or just the whole process itself of, you know, how to actually create the figure using, you know, PowerPoint or some sort of program? Do you know if there's any resources like that available for people?
Well, I guess it depends on the type of figure. You know, at the Marshfield Clinic Research Institute, sometimes I don't know what we have now because our staff has been downgraded. I work sometimes with some of our researchers in creating figures. Some of our biostatisticians have worked with creating figures and diagrams. It all depends on the type of figure that they need. There are programs out there that you can get, like for creating diagrams and tables, and but one of those, it's kind of a complicated question to ask. Yeah, somebody just said BioRender can help with figures and posters.
Cool. Well, thanks for adding that into the chat, Maria. If anybody knows any other resources to help with that, you know, send it our way so we can pass it along to your fellow faculty and students and scientists here. Were there any other questions for Marie? Otherwise, we will switch over to Nasia. Oop, here is one. When explaining statistical analysis, can it be assumed that basic statistic measures would be well known, like ANOVA or t-test, or should we fully explain it?
It depends on the journal that you've chosen and the target audience of the journal. I mean, generally, you need to explain the basic statistics that you're using when you're explaining your methodology, but most of the time you're not going to need to go into complete detail. It really depends on your journal, on your audience, and the type of paper that you've written.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Marie. We're going to switch over to Nasia, who's going to talk about how we craft a great story for our manuscript.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And can you see my slides okay? And can you hear me okay?
Yep, both are great.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Nasia Safdar from ICTR, UW, and the Division of Infectious Diseases. And as you all just heard, you know, there's a lot to be said for getting the language right and the grammar right and the formatting right for a paper. And without those, it is very clear that it would immediately come back for you to fix those before you resubmit. But more important than those things is crafting the story. You know, both of these things have to be important, but as a disciplinary expert, crafting the story is only something that you can do with your mentor or your co-authors, whereas the grammar and the language, there's often a lot of help available that we should absolutely always take advantage of, because if there's errors, then that doesn't look good for anybody, including the editor's time. So this is just as a side thing, you know, when I first started out doing papers and writing manuscripts, my co-authors and I would really take the time to do a line-by-line editing of the paper. And while that can still be done, I think in today's world of having multiple irons in the fire, trying to seek funding as well as write, and often things happening at the same time, it's important to remember that as a mentor, and when you ask your mentor for feedback, you can say this as well, that what you're looking for is insights into the thinking and into the story, which is something that you will not be able to get easily any other way. Whereas the copious written corrections, while, you know, you may decide whether you want to welcome them or not, is not something that where the mentor's mind should be going as the first thing. Now, obviously, this is not something that comes immediately to anyone. When you first start writing a manuscript of any kind, you recognize that obviously reading papers, particularly in the field that you're interested in publishing, is key, but eventually doing it is important to learning it. And it's learned through repetition and imitation of your peers, your mentors, your co-authors, your colleagues. And if you go back and see the first paper that you published and the one that you're publishing now, and some time has elapsed, you will no doubt notice how strong the language has gotten, how much easier it has become for you. And it's not that it has necessarily become easier, but just that you've gotten better at doing the hard thing of writing the paper. But it takes time and it happens gradually. But the most important thing is practice. And speaking leads to writing, writing leads to speaking. So it's not that one has to write only as the way of getting practice. Any type of communication that is scientific will reinforce the other types. I say this only because sometimes, and I was like this too, that, you know, when you first start out, you might get very discouraged if the first paper isn't exactly what you had hoped it would be, or it's not immediately picked up by the journal that you thought it would be. That is the norm and it's expected. And that is just the way these things go. Now, when we look at the landscape of the scientific style, we use the analogy of a tree. And so there are two parts of the tree. You see what's visible and you see what's not visible. And when you see what's easily visible, and this is something that somebody first starting out in publication, the eye gets drawn to it immediately, you know, when you're reading a paper, for instance. So you think a great deal about the vocabulary. The scientific world has a certain terminology that we all have to become familiar with. We have to get seamless and flawless in saying it. There's a spelling, the paragraphs, all of which has just been talked about extensively, the grammar, the sentence, and the punctuation. These are things that are easy to see, so the eye gets drawn to it. But what's invisible from the standpoint of crafting the story is more important than what's visible. And what's invisible that you get practice with time and get better at with your mentors and co-authors are the things that are listed here. So the persuasiveness of your of the language, the argumentation that you're making, the disciplinary style, what's expected from the journal and how closely you are adhering to what's expected, the cohesion of the story. I think, as was mentioned earlier, you know, anything that sounds very repetitive, for instance, or doesn't logically lead from one argument to the next, readers will get confused. And what does a reader do when they get confused? They immediately move on to something else. So if you want to write, certainly write, but if you want people to read it, you have to write for the reader. And the first reader that you'll come across is the editor. So all of this stuff is obviously learnable, and language professionals and apps and software and so on can be very helpful in helping us get better at this. You know, some of the stuff you just saw that is really important, such as do you capitalize things at certain points and not at other points? Editors will pick that up, no doubt, but a language professional can help you a great deal with that. What the disciplinary expert, and that might be your co-authors, your team, or your mentors, the stuff that they should be helping you with is the invisible part of it, the thing that goes into crafting the story. And as I said, this comes with time. So over time, you will see that your mentor's tree might look like this. You know, they will have learned all the grammar and the punctuation and the syntax, but more importantly, they will have learned also how to interpret the data, to discover the 2 or 3 key messages that you want to put in the paper, and how to write about it in a way that it creates a story that people will want to read, and therefore it gets published. All of us, when we're first starting out, our tree is going to look like this. So a lot of attention to the stuff that is important, but not as important as what's in the root. And so it's a matter of time, but it's also a matter of intentionality, and it's also a matter of continuous attention to the stuff that is part of the storytelling that goes into the manuscript. So I made this argument today for this paper. Next time when I write a different one, maybe my argument making skills will have improved because I've put effort and I'm talking to the right people to develop that. Now, there's lots of ways to get to the core elements of the approach to manuscript writing. And I'll talk about one that came to me through this website and this program called Scientific Communication Advances Research Excellence. And I'll give the link to the website in the last slide. So when you're creating a storyline, before you get into the deep dive of writing the paper, you want to come up with a set of a few key sentences. And that's just, it's kind of like an outline, but it's not even as fleshed out as an outline. Because I have found that sometimes we tend to get overwhelmed even with the thought of creating an outline. So a few key sentences is what's a good step to start with. And this is not an actual communication to a reader or an audience. This is just a template for one or more finished communications. And once you create a template for one, you can use it for other things, especially since most of the stuff we tend to publish, the disciplines are fairly closed. So it's not likely that you will be going from a completely new idea to a brand new idea, publication to publication. All sort of builds upon each other. And the narrative that you'll be creating for this template is going to be simple, everyday language, and should be in the first person singular. So let's look at an example of how that might work in practice. But first, let's think about what are the benefits of this exercise. This exercise produces the benefit of helping us think through what the story will be. It doesn't force us to immediately start writing because it forces you to think about, well, I have all this data. What are the 2 or 3 key things? Because anything more than 3 key messages is going to overwhelm the editor and therefore your chances of getting published. And it's applicable to all forms of scientific reporting. It eliminates vagueness, as we'll see in a moment, and it can be introduced at any time. Sometimes we get into this issue of getting stuck where we think we have to write the whole draft in one go. This exercise doesn't depend on having results. So you can get your hands warm and get started at any time, and then you can add bits to it as you continue to work through the paper. And the reason why we're doing this exercise is because ultimately, the problem is confronted with this massive data on the left. We don't really understand where we're headed before we start to write. And if we don't understand that, then you might find yourself having to go back and reworking things. And while that's okay up to a point, it can sometimes lead to feeling discouraged that you're having to rework the stuff that you thought you had already completed. So this is what would be considered the standard elements of a research report. You've got the background, the gap, the purpose, the approach, results, conclusion. All of this, I think, will be very familiar to most of us on this call here. But this is a lot, right? So how do we use the new approach to writing and this exercise that we just talked about? We're going to focus on 3 things. We're going to focus on the gap in knowledge, the purpose, and the approach. But look at the order of things. Rather than starting from the gap to the purpose and then the approach, which is the way the manuscript will no doubt look like, because in the introduction, you have to go from broad to narrow. But for the purposes of writing your template, your own storyline, you're going to start with the approach. In part because you know what you did, and therefore it's easier to write about it than to start from something else that might be a little bit more abstract. So it's going to be the approach followed by the purpose. You did the approach in order to do what, and why did you do it eventually? To fill what gap in knowledge. So that order is important. Starting with the approach can help us isolate some of these other elements of the purpose and of the gap in knowledge. And you'll see in a second how I've applied that to the work that I do. So in the approach, you should say in one sentence what you did generally, using your first person singular. And that's the approach. What was your goal in doing that is the purpose statement. And the hint here is that purpose statements will generally have words like in order to, or we aimed, we sought, we had the goal of doing that. This is going to be in the past tense, and that's your purpose statement. And eventually, what is the gap? Why are we doing this work at all? And gaps will have negative phrases like, we don't yet know this, it's yet to be described, it's unclear, has been inadequately examined. Those are the gap statements. So for example, this is just an example of what I did as an approach, is that I cultured C. difficile, which is a bacteria that I study that causes diarrhea. I cultured C. diff from stool specimens collected from participants over a 2-year period in the university hospital. A simple statement in plain language in the first person of what I did. And because I know what I did, this was a little bit easier for me to just put down on paper that was my approach. Now, if we follow the template, the next one will be the purpose. And the words to get to the purpose are in order to. So I did this, the approach, in order to determine the frequency of positivity for C. diff in human stool specimens. And the next thing will be the gap. And why did I do this? What gap am I trying to fill? Because until now, what % of human stool specimens from hospitalized patients contain C. diff is unknown. So you can see that moving from the approach to the gap, obviously you'll have to flesh this out in the actual manuscript, but for purposes of the template, this frees up your mind, it frees up your writing, and it allows you to focus on the one key message from this paper that I want everybody to know is, I now know what % of human stool specimens have C. diff in hospitalized patients. You can use this for any number of types of manuscripts, and you can use this even for the same paper if you have more than one key message. Use the same template, either adapting the approach statement or using the same, because often we have more than one question that we answer in a single paper. So we've talked about, reversing the order for the template writing. We've talked about first writing the approach, then writing the purpose statement, and then writing the gap. The next thing that people get stuck at is often thinking about, well, what do I do with these results? How do I describe the significance and the implications of the work that I have done? And one hack that I have used is to think about, for significance, look to the purpose. So for instance, in my purpose, I said I cultured specimens in order to identify the % positivity of C. diff in stool specimens. The significance of this work is that we now know something we didn't know before, which is that what % of stool specimens have C. diff. And that's why this has advanced the field. So that's the significance part. Implications, you look to the gap. So why did you do the work at all? Because we didn't completely understand how C. diff behaves in hospitalized patients, for instance. And so now that we know this, implications has more to do with how do you want the people to use your results? What's the next step? So the next step is now we can develop interventions if we want to prevent C. diff in hospitalized patients. So for significance, look to the purpose statement to help you write the significance. And for implications, look to the gap. And the gap will be in the introduction, in the prepared manuscript, where you describe that there's this gap and I'm going to fill it now with this approach that I'm describing. And in the discussion, when you talk about implications, go back to that gap in knowledge that you described, say that you have filled it, and say, well, implications for clinicians, for researchers, for the lay public, for policymakers, what can they do with this information that you have just provided to them? So I have found that helpful in my own work to try and better understand how to create this template. And now I can flesh this out to make it into a manuscript using the conventions of manuscript. So to summarize, to get started, to loosen the stuckness, work from the approach, and stay close to what you actually did to write the approach. You identify the core elements, starting from the approach, then the purpose, and then the gap, using plain language. For the purpose, it will be in order to statements. For the gap, it will be negative statements. We don't know this yet. We don't understand this yet. And then for the rest of it, for the aspects that we get stuck at in the discussion, which is a significance and implication. For the significance, you look to the purpose. And for the implications, you look to the gap. And we'll provide all these slides so people can look at it. But it would be a good exercise to try it out. And I think that you will enjoy trying this new method of getting unstuck. All of this is taken from the SCORE Resources website, which is an enormous wealth of information for people. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. I think that was the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take questions as time allows.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, these slides will be up, as well as the link for this will also be included in our resource guide. So I definitely have checked out this website and it is awesome. So everybody should check it out. So any questions, if you guys have them, put them in the chat, please. We do have a few minutes. We probably have time for one question. Give them a minute to think about it. I guess I'll ask a question while we wait. So once you have this sort of template of your plain language, how would you then implement it into your manuscript? Would you, make the language a little more scientific to fit the language that the manuscript calls for? Or would you just, have that story in your head as you go to write your manuscript?
Thank you, Jen. Yeah, so I use it to craft the story. For writing the paper, you will need to adhere to, of course, as you know, all the language stuff and all the formatting and the typical language of the discipline. But this is when you're confronted with a pile of data and you don't know, what do I talk about? What's the message going to be? And so this helps with the creation of the story. It's an adjunct to and not in place of the typical. way that we do things.
Okay, so there is a couple questions that just came in. What do you do if you find a paper published with your contributions? Oh, I think this one goes back to you, Whitney. I will come back to that one. Let's see if there's one for Nasia.
The last one.
The last one.
You could share that you feel.
Oh, okay. Is there an example publication you could share that you feel follows these best practices?
Yes, I think, it's a little bit tricky to find it in the publication because it's meant for the crafting the story piece. But when you read a really great introduction and a really great discussion, and I can share one of those with the group here, then you know that they spent time thinking about the story. When it's mostly just a litany of, we found this, here's what people can do with it, but there's no cohesion to it, then you know that they're just rewriting their results in different language, but there hasn't been the time spent in thinking about the story and what this means to the field. So I will share that. There's lots of great examples out there.
Yeah, if you want to pass that to me, I can add it to the resource guide. Well, thank you so much, Nasia. Whitney, if you want to answer this question, she's working her way over here. So yeah, what do you do when you find papers with your contribution where you weren't included as the author?
So I feel like that's a fairly complicated question, and two approaches come to mind. One is to contact the authors of the paper and see if there's a way to negotiate that with them and have them reach out to the publisher to print a correction. Now, I'm guessing this is being asked because that's not always the most effective way. You can actually reach out to the journals yourself and contact the editors to let them know that there are these problems. I've never actually been involved in this, so I couldn't give you the details, but I know that you can reach out to the editors of the journal if you can't negotiate with the authors yourself.
And then there, a little bit at the end was what do you do when you are on as author, but you were not given a chance to approve the data and the images and everything?
Right. Again, that's sort of similar to my previous answer, which is I review the paper. And then if there's things that you don't agree with, to again contact the authors and or the editor. Part of the whole authorship policy idea is to hopefully prevent some of these things from happening by setting out your plan for manuscript preparation and who's going to be included on the paper. But we know that, as my very first line, that doesn't always happen. So I hope that's helpful.
And you guys could always contact Whitney
Yes.
here at ICTR with Team Science for more authorship questions. But thank you so much for joining us today. Our next month's sessions are in-person editing workshops, so check your registration if you signed up for that. Otherwise, our next Zoom meeting is going to be in June, talking about navigating the actual submission process in dealing with reviewer comments. So look out for my email later today with all of these resources. But thank you so much for coming. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.